It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. Take Command Podcast. Craig Hoffman here. Logan Paulsen there. And we are going to be joined today in just a second by our pal Robert Mays, who is the host of the Athletic Football Show. We're going to get into a lot of the offense of the Commanders, big picture, some granular detail, put it in context throughout the rest of the league. Anything else we should say before we let folks hear the conversation with Robert? Logan,
yeah, I mean, super smart dude. I mean, his insight of like the league is really cool, and the way he's able to kind of layer in the Commanders kind of in these general like big picture football philosophies is, I thought he did a great job. And smart dude. We all like having smart people on the pod, so.
For sure. And we both listen to his show with Derek Klassen on the regular basis. So great one. And so Robert will join us in just a second. Then on the back end of that conversation, Logan and I are going to dive into kind of the big meaty topic that has been sitting there waiting for us since the weekend that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet, which is the Commanders cutting another first-round pick. Emmanuel Forbes released. And Mathis, by the way, a second-round pick. Healthy scratch. So we'll talk about the state of the defense and specifically those two guys and kind of what went wrong or what is going wrong and what that leaves behind for the Commanders and Joe Witt and Dan Quinn to scheme around, figure out, because when you have a lot of players that you're counting on that are high draft pick guys that aren't available, that certainly creates some problems to be solved. But first, before we get to our chat with Robert, quick reminder. One, we got a mailbag coming on Tuesday, so we'd love your questions. You can go email, which is a contact form at hoffmanshow.com, Instagram, Blue Sky, whatever it is that you want to get in touch with us there. Also, we'd love to hear from you on what you think of the show. So go to hoffmanshow.com/survey, fill out our audience survey, and you might find a special treat at the end. Call it a holiday gift. All right, without further ado, here's our chat with Robert Mays. Joining us today, I happen to think, this is personal bias, he's also my friend, and I'm not saying this because he's my friend, but I think that this guy is the best NFL podcast host in the NFL universe. I think that there's nobody who watches it more, gets it more, has better perspective. He hates the fact that I'm saying this from the Athletic Football Show. It's my guy, Robert Mays. What's up, Mays?
It's embarrassing, but I sincerely appreciate the compliment, even if I do not want to take it in this sort of forum.
Yeah, I made sure to. I did that while we were recording. I could tell you that anytime I wanted to, but now everybody knows. And people do get some of your insights watered down on this show because often I go, I was listening to Robert Mays on the Athletic Football Show the other day, and he said this really interesting thing, and then I just say the interesting thing you said. But we wanted to have you on here during the bye week because it's a great time to kind of check in on the team, do a larger, wider review, try to get some perspective and some context. And for someone who does watch every team to the depth that you do, I think you're a great person to do that with. So let's start with the widest possible kind of jumping off point, widest possible question, which is, what have you made of the Commanders season compared to the expectations you had for them coming into it?
Well, I want to be clear about this. I don't think they were necessarily just my expectations. I think
Sure.
A lot of people had these sorts of expectations. If you were looking at what sort of win-loss record they would have, even down to the granular stuff, the expectations people had for certain position groups. Coming into the year, there were guys I really respected that put in the work, that thought Washington would have the worst offensive line in the league, for example. And I just think their ability to transcend those expectations and just play at a level that I think nobody anticipated. Some of that is a rookie quarterback that's played at a really high level for large swaths of the year. Some of that is just the infrastructure and coaching on both sides of the ball. I think pretty unequivocally, this has been the best story, the team that has outpaced their expectations the most of any team in the NFL.
You visited training camp last time we actually saw you. You were fresh off a red eye. You were hanging on for dear life.
It was so hot that day too. It was. I was miserable.
So I don't know how much you remember that day from that day versus how much you just tried to block out for your own personal safety. But do you remember leaving Ashburn that day with any inkling of like, maybe some of the stuff they're doing here, they might have a chance, or we're still kind of like, hey, all this other homework that I've done, all the opinions that I've taken in, all the signs point to them not being very good this year.
It's always hard to tell. Everybody's in such a good mood during that stretch of the calendar, even when you have basement level expectations like this team did coming in. There's a level of confidence, there's level of optimism that kind of pervades the conversations you have in July and August every single year. And there are a few things now that stand out as little nuggets that maybe I should have paid a little bit more attention to. Some things that Cliff said to me in the conversation that I had with him, notably him being like, yeah, I think our best personnel group actually might be 21 when we have Austin and Brian Robinson on the field. And when he said that, I was like, okay. That's something that sounds great in training camp, but never actually works out. Teams that have used those pony personnel packages consistently, it's always something that's better on the board than it is in reality. And Washington has been an exception to that. I mean, they've done such a great job out of that look. And I think that is indicative of just the larger conversation about this team. Some of the quirks and some of the things that they thought that they could do well have worked even better than they probably could have anticipated. And the other thing that he said to me that I've parroted multiple times on our show that I think is really important is I asked him, how do you think this is going to be different than your last couple of years in Arizona? And I think his ability to have his purview be completely the offense, not have to worry about anything else. I can focus on every detail. This is my day-to-day job in a way that it has never been in the NFL. He had never been an NFL offensive coordinator without having play calling duties. And for somebody with whom we've had so much experience, that's just a really unique backdrop. Like there's no one else in the NFL we would possibly say that about, right? There's never been somebody who's been a college only coach, then been a play caller in the league. And we've known him for 3, 4, 5 seasons, but this is the first time he's been an OC. So the upside and the potential period of what he could be as an offensive play caller solely focusing on the offense, it's been better than I think anybody could have hoped coming into the year.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, significantly better. One thing I wanted to ask you, and you got me thinking, because about our conversation we had, and I don't know if you remember it during training camp about can you tell if a team's going to be good during training camp? And you watch a lot of training camps, you talk to a lot of coaches, and that's why I think you're kind of uniquely qualified to talk about this. Like, what is that magic pixie dust that happens from training camp to the season? And I think it's like a confidence thing with a team. Guys play above their skis because they get a little more confident, but it's something you can't really tell. And so again, you cover a lot of football. Like, what do you think about this team specifically has caused this gel, this thing to kind of gel together and work? You mentioned the quarterback, offensive line's playing better, but it wasn't something that we were talking about in training camp, but it kind of happens on the job training. What do you think causes that, I guess?
I think energy is something you can absolutely pick up on. There was an example 2 years ago, not this offseason, but the previous offseason. I was in LA and I was there. I go to LA for the first stop of camp pretty much every single year. That's how I usually build my trip. And the Chargers and the Rams practice about 10 minutes away from each other. They always have, even though they just recently switched where they do that. And so you can hit both of them in the same day. And I was at Rams training camp in the evening, and they were supposed to be one of the worst teams in the league. They were supposed to be one of the worst offenses in the league. And I left that practice and I was like, there's no way. This team is winning.
What about it though? What I'm saying?
It was the energy. It was just the 11-on-11 session at the end of practice. The pure, uncut energy from the young players and the coaching staff. And I think that to me was the biggest change between the 2024 Rams and previous iterations of those Rams teams under McVay. The staff had been picked over to such an extent in 22 and 21 and 22 after they won the Super Bowl. And especially after they won the Super Bowl in 21, they just didn't have time to really make a lot of considered decisions about who the next group of those coaches would be as they moved on from a bunch of guys. And the guys that they brought in, whether it was Mike LaFleur, Nick Caley is their tight ends coach, who I have a lot of respect for. They brought back Aubrey Pleasant, who was their DBs coach that went to Detroit. Just so many guys that had tons of juice. And that can mislead you every once in a while. But in that particular case, I was like, as long as Stafford stays healthy, this team is not going to be one of the worst offenses in the league. I think they're going to be a lot better than people expect. With Washington, I think you got some of that. I mean, on the day I was there, Craig, they completed 4 or 5 deep passes that probably should have been more of a signal to me than they were in the moment. It's always hard to separate training camp performance from the defense you're playing against. What were you trying to install that day, et cetera? But I think it looked a lot cleaner in retrospect after seeing them, and that probably should have been something I paid a little bit more attention to. But I think overall, Logan, to me, the answer would be just the energy you're bringing to practice and what those sessions typically feel like.
When we dive into some of the granular details, I think for me, this season has been so enjoyable, not because it's hey, they're winning. This is cool. I get to cover guys that are scoring more points than the other team. That's new for me on this beat for most of the years I've been doing it. But also, I've covered obviously a lot of the West Coast guys. I was on the beat for Jay, and Sean was there for the first couple of years. And so that was kind of my introduction to NFL offense at that level. And then you have a couple of years of Scott Turner, obviously Bieniemy last year, different variety of West Coast offense. And then working with Logan all these years now, like he came up in this West Coast system a lot, although he played for a couple other different systems in his career, but really, that Kyle West Coast base. And so seeing some similar things that Cliff is doing, but getting to them in different ways, and some of those different thought processes, and kind of the blending of some stuff that you go back to, and you're like, oh, that's an air raid concept that he's now configured to 12 personnel in the NFL, or hey, this was never in his offense in Arizona. He's took this from Sean or from Kyle or whoever that he's clearly watched. What are some things that you've come to appreciate about Cliff as a schemer, as a play caller, and the way that he's going about his business this year that has then helped Jaden play at the level that he has? Some of these receivers maybe overachieve, if you will, and on down the list.
I think three things. The first thing that stands out is the running game, period. It's one of my favorite things to be watching this entire season. It's just the structure of the running game and the design of the running game. I've joked about this a few different times. I'll be trying to watch Jaden Daniels, and I just keep getting distracted by Sam Cosmi. And that's happened a dozen times as I've been trying to study this team over the course of the year. And all the work they're doing with multiple pullers, the angles they're creating in the running game, the level they've had that group play out front consistently has just been so impressive. And that extends to the pass protection plan. One of the things I keep coming back to this all year just because I think it's a really good example of adherence to details as both an offense and as both an organization. Watching the development plan for Brandon Coleman specifically over the course of the season, you watch that. All right, we're going to play him a half dozen snaps this game. We're going to ramp it up slowly. When we put him in more as a full-time starter, we're going to make sure when we're playing against the Myles Garretts of the world, he's getting chip help on pretty much every single play. We're limiting the amount of one-on-ones he's getting. This is somebody who I think clearly has a ton of physical talent and is really intriguing to me as a player. And watching them be so intentional about how they brought him along, that to me is the sign of an organization that knows what it's trying to do and why it's trying to do it. And I think that extends to the entire offensive line. All of those double chip looks that they've been using, just the ability to make things easier on those guys up front has really stood out. And with Jaden specifically, their ability to effectively attack some of these zone coverages, whether it's with the high-lows that they use or some of the 4 strong looks that they use where they're overloading certain things, getting the ball onto the perimeter. I just think that they've done a great job of making the quarterback's life as easy as possible as often as they can. And that's not to take away anything from Jaden. If you're a coaching staff in the NFL and you have a rookie quarterback, that's what you should be doing. That should be the goal all the time. And I just think that they've done a really impressive job with all of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think those are all three things that really characterize the offense. One thing I wanted to kind of double click on there is there's not a lot of you can tell there's not a lot of offensive play volume. When you watch I don't know, like Sean Payton with New Orleans or even Ben Johnson, you can tell they've got a lot in. You know what I mean? There's lots of plays, lots of different formations, lots of motions. And Cliff is I want to say keeps it pretty simple. It sounds like you think that's an advantage in terms of developing a young quarterback. Because I look at what they did with Caleb in Chicago, and Shane Waldron's got 1,000 check with me's, and it's way too complicated. But sometimes you just got to let it rip. And kind of how do you think Cliff's walked that line over the course of the year with the quarterback, with the offense, and how do you think that's helped these guys play fast?
I honestly think that there's probably been some drawbacks, especially early in the season. Remember the first couple games when they were just refusing to let him push the ball down the field, and there was some frustration with that. But I just think it's impressive to understand that the end goal is the most important goal, even if you're sacrificing some short-term stuff. So yeah, is it maybe easier to get a beat on you this season because of the volume of stuff you're putting in? Potentially. But I still think that trying to bring this thing along at the right pace is probably the better approach for the long-term success of your quarterback and thus the long-term success of your offense. You can make a serious argument that throwing Caleb Williams into the deep end of the pool and asking him to do all of those checks, all of that stuff at the line of scrimmage is potentially a payoff for down the road. But I still don't think it was the right approach early on. I still feel like that is I think you put too much on him. So I think that the way that Washington has approached it, for me, is probably the better way to handle a young quarterback and a young offense. I mean, every single guy, this is their first year in this system. So I have no issue with paring it down a little bit, especially compared to the teams that you talked about. And the funny part about both of those teams, Ben Johnson, even if he's not from New Orleans, Dan Campbell is, some of their assistants were. So both of those teams come from that New Orleans system where, they're going to have 10,000 plays that they're bringing into every single season, and it's up to the guys to get it right.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, I think both of you, I think it'd be interesting for listeners to hear and fans to kind of understand the downsides here, because we can talk about how, maybe it's limited them. It's been a pretty damn good offense this year. So, if the point is to move the ball and score points, I don't know how much more you're going to ask for. They just put 42, obviously, on Tennessee, and that's in part compounded by a comedy of errors by the Titans and one of the worst halves of football any team will play this year. That Titans first half, but they put 40 on Carolina when we thought Carolina was starting to turn things around. It turns out they were. Washington just spanked them, and a couple of other teams where they've had these high 30s outputs this year. So, what are the downsides? And I guess if you want to look at it through the flip side of that lens, where does the offense grow from here and get even better than what it's been?
My answer to that would be, I think it makes you less flexible. If you look at this team's numbers versus zone and man coverage specifically, they have absolutely ripped apart teams that want to play zone against them. I mentioned some of the high lows that they were able to create, even just some of those spacing concepts they were running against Tennessee last week, and making sure that they're always giving him an option against some of those sorts of zone coverages. But then you look at when teams have played a little bit of stickier man against them, and when Jaden hasn't been able to scramble, they have fewer answers against those sorts of defenses. So I just think that if your purview is limited and the scope of your offense is limited, you might have fewer solutions as teams start to throw a bunch of different problems at you. That'd probably be where I would land.
Well, this is again more of a philosophical debate, but I always felt that versus man coverage, it's like a horse race. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If you don't have the horses, then everything you do versus man becomes a little bit more challenging. And
I think
that's
exactly
something,
right.
Yeah, that's something Craig and I have talked a lot about with this team, just lacking that top tier elite, kind of offensive line for the protection purposes, so we can hold the ball versus man, and then the elite receiver, the elite kind of slot guy. And that's not a criticism of the personnel they have now. It's just when you look at the top flight teams, like Philly, look at Detroit, they have answers at every spot of guys has just got a ton of juice and create mismatches versus man coverage versus any team in the NFL. The thing that I keep coming back to with this limited game plan is maybe more teams should do this. And the reason I say that is because I played with Kyle, and Kyle will carry, probably 120 plays. Sean's probably in the 140, and semantics in terms of motions and shifts and all that kind of stuff. But it feels like Cliff is not carrying more than 70 plays, more than maybe even less than that, 60 plays. And the thing is, if you can edit it down and let guys play fast and let guys own answers, they only run probably 5 runs. It feels like a lot of runs because they know the adjustments for each front. But that's the thing I keep coming back to. Maybe this is the way teams should go. Maybe you should be hey, we like the fact that this is this truncated volume. Let's Jaden know the answer versus 6 coverages, and lets him really own the response. So I don't know. It's been really interesting and kind of in some ways humbling for me to watch this, because I thought there was one way to do it. Play volume, guys got to know it. We got to figure it out. We're going to beat you with the pen every single time. But sometimes it's hey man, let the dudes play fast. And that's what this has shown me is really, if you feel good about your install and you feel good about your game plan, the guys will have the answers based on the install. And so I think that's something that, again, like I said, been very humbling for me to watch this evolution of this kind of game plan, if that makes sense.
My response to that would be, I think that totally makes sense. I think that if you're going to play that way, and there were times where I think the Rams pared their volume down a little bit over the last couple of years, but by formation and alignment and motion, they just were making things a lot more difficult on the teams that they were playing against,
Sure.
even if the offense was a little bit simpler. And I think that's the one thing that you just haven't seen as much of from Washington, where, okay, if we're going to run the same 70 plays, can we run the same 70 plays? I'm not good at math, 500 different ways because
Right.
of how many different ways we align, different formations, different motions, different shifts, etc. I think that may be the next stage of this, because if you're going to run the same 70 plays and Terry's going to be in the same spot on 65 of those plays, I think that's when it becomes a little bit too simple and a little bit too easy for teams to understand what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think that's something that I keep kicking around too. It's like you expect them to hit a wall, and they hit walls versus better teams. But like when you look at Philly, for example, like that defense is presenting a wall versus everybody. Like
Yes.
Baltimore's maybe the best offense in the NFL, and they made them look kind of inept. And then like Pittsburgh, talking that defense, their ability to play man coverage, like you're talking about, but versus kind of like the not top 5 defenses in the NFL, it seems to work. And that's the thing where it's like it seems to subvert every offensive pillar or every offensive foundation that I would kind of say is essential, but it just works. And so like, I don't know. I don't have a good answer as to why, other than the guys know what to do versus all these different looks. And like, I agree with you. Like maybe next year you got to kind of say, hey, we got to do some more stuff, move it around a little bit. But for this year, it's crazy to see how effective it's been. And I don't know. Again, like, maybe they figure it out next week. I don't know, but it is interesting to watch.
Yeah, it does kind of confirm something though that I think we've talked about before, Logan, and that's something that I've kind of understood from covering this league for a while now is 10 guys executing the perfect plan and one guy messing it up is way worse than 11 guys executing an inferior plan.
Yeah.
Like if you can get everyone on the same page, that is the optimal way, even if it's not the best, but everyone's working towards the same goal, you give yourself a chance. And that, then if you have 11 guys and like 8 of them are one of the 10 best guys at that position in the league, well, now all of a sudden you can beat those top 5 teams. Which kind of brings us to the one of the other things we want to talk about, Robert, which is how surprised are you that they're able to do this at all, considering the state of their roster? They cut Emmanuel Forbes last week. Now, all 4 of their previous first-round picks are gone. So, the last 5 years, the guy they drafted number 2 overall in this draft is the only first-rounder they have. They also, healthy scratch Fidarian Mathis, one of their second-round picks. They didn't have a second-rounder in one of those other drafts. So we're talking about an extreme, not only talent dearth, because you get your best players through the draft, but also then having to build it without the cheap labor that the NFL relies upon, relatively cheap for salary cap purposes. So, when we talk about them being able to elevate against some of these top 5 teams, obviously you think if they can execute a similar plan with better dudes in the future, that might solve that top 5 team problem. But also just, how, like, I guess also someone with your purview and your memory of recent memory of the league, like, can you think of any other examples that overachieve based off talent on this level that have dug themselves out of this kind of hole?
It's a great question. I mean, I think that Denver this year has done a very good job with the pieces that they have. And I think that the difference between them and Washington, in my opinion, is the individual talent along the offensive line is better for the Broncos than it is for Washington, right? Denver has a left tackle that they've paid. They have a right tackle that they paid in free agency. There's a veteran. Washington built its offensive line partially through free agency too. If you look at the resources spent on a Nick Allegretti and an Andrew Wiley versus what Ben Powers, Garrett Bowles, Mike McGlinchey, even Quinn Miners after his extension have been getting, it's a little bit different. So I think that their ability to hold up front is a little bit more notable, but from a pass catching perspective, they don't really have a lot of guys and they've still been a pretty good offense. So I think that would be another recent example. But other than that, it would be hard to find a team playing at a top 5-ish sort of level that has as little proven talent on its offense as this. I think another possibly good example is what Green Bay was doing like last year. It was all these young receivers, all these unproven guys, and they were still playing at a top 5 level. The quarterback was obviously a veteran, even if we had never seen him before, but similar sort of thing. It's rooted in details. It's rooted in the job that Matt LaFleur did. And I think that Cliff Kingsbury is doing a similar quality sort of job this year.
Yeah, 100%. Like those are really good examples. And it's interesting because it kind of goes back to that thing you talked about at the beginning of the show, which is just like, it's the details. It's understanding like kind of the culture and the coaching points and allowing the guys the opportunity to bring it to life. And I think that's the thing that I keep coming back to. It's like whatever the plan is, it seems to be working because he knows Cliff and Joe Witt Jr., they know kind of where their weaknesses are. They call games accordingly. And it just is it's like intuitively well coached. And I think that's maybe the question for you is like, you've talked to Sean, who's one of the best coaches in the NFL. You've talked to a lot of dudes around the league that are really good coaches. Like what makes those guys in your conversations with them such good coaches and such good communicators, such good teachers that allows them to elevate these situations? And again, it's a little bit like 50-50. It's got to be the right personnel, the right personalities, all that stuff's important. But what have you seen from those guys?
I've said this a bunch this season, and I think that because of where we are in the head coaching cycle and what this next crop is going to look like, and just the last few years, how we've picked over so many of the offensive-minded head coaches, and that cupboard is pretty bare right now. Are we going to try to find guys who maybe are a little bit more of these CEO types? And it's caused me to just think about the demands on being a head coach in the NFL specifically. And I've kind of in jest said this a bunch this year. It's a really hard job, right? It's a really hard job to be in charge of. Logan, what would you say? A head coach is probably the manager of 150 to 200 people when you consider the entire roster, the entire coaching staff, equipment staff, support staff, etc. So you're the manager of 200 or so people. The top 53 people on that list, and let's say a few of the coaching staff guys, are millionaires. So you are having to organize and manage 200 people, a quarter of which make millions of dollars a year, and you have to make them excited to come to work and slam their head against somebody else's 5 days a week for 20 weeks. That is a very, very, very difficult job. And I think that the two things that have to work in conjunction for you to be good at that, you have to have presence, right? That is the number one thing, just being a head coach in the NFL. When you stand in front of the room, you have to have a certain, even if it's not a dynamism about you, you have to have something compelling that the guys in that room are going to attach themselves to. But I also think when I've gotten to do this a little bit more and I've gotten deeper into my career, and I'll go back to a conversation I had with Dan Quinn this summer, something he said to me that I think is a good thing for a coach to say. I asked him what they were going to do defensively. Is this going to look like it looked like in Dallas, where you're playing all this man, you're doing all this stuff up front? And he said something that I thought is a perfect answer. It's like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what we're going to do because I've only had these guys for a week. And I think that the combination to me of having presence at the front of the room, being compelling, causing your guys to buy in that way, while also having the humility to ride the waves of an NFL season. The guys I've seen fail as NFL coaches that I know really well are the guys when you talk to them on August 1st and they think they know how the season's going to go. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. They think they can see things that other people can't. And I think that is a mistake. I think being wired that way, unless you are truly like a visionary, I think that McVay is able to do that sometimes, where Sean's able to say, all right, I think this is what's coming around the bend for the league. And I think that has given him advantages in certain moments. But Sean, I think that there is still more of a humility to Sean than most people probably understand. So having those two things in equal parts, where I have this feel, this charisma, this presence about me, while also being able to understand I don't have all the answers and I'm willing to ride the ups and downs of the year. Those are the two things that I would probably say are the most important.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, that's it takes a special person to do that, and it's so hard as a coach and as a player to do that too. Because like you want to kind of, and you can probably speak to this too. You want to invest your time in the thing you think is going to work. You know what I'm saying? Like ideally, you'd like to have an answer in August of saying like, this is the coverage, this is what we want to be installing. But then the understanding that we're going to install our stuff, but we're going to pick 3 of these things to be really good at. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of humility. It takes a lot of work, like you're saying. And I know Dan's got that. And have you talked to Cliff? Does he understand that too? Or like that would be another kind of interesting thing because you've talked with him more than we have probably.
I mean, I've only had a couple conversations with Cliff in my life. I talked to him in Arizona a couple times, and I talked to him this summer. And I mean, if you've interacted with Cliff at all, he's chill as hell.
Yeah.
Cliff is just a very chilled out dude. And so I think that, yeah, there is like a level of humility to the way that he's approaching things. And I think that for offensive coaches, I just think it's about details. I think that becomes the most important part. When you are the offensive coordinator, and I think too often as part of these discussions, and I've tried to like use this term as often as I can to illustrate what I'm talking about here, play caller is important. Offensive architect is more important. What you're doing from Monday through Saturday is as important as the sequencing of the plays. So, I mean, people I think are misconstrue that. They think the guy calling the plays, that's what is the most important thing. Whoever the offensive architect is and how that offensive architecture gets built, that becomes the most important thing. And when I think about Washington this year, the offensive architecture is what I come back to. It's the intentionality behind the details on pretty much everything they're doing. You saw it from the beginning. And those are the good offenses. And like you guys have alluded to, where you start to see the gap is when the talent gap exists. And I think that's kind of where we are with this team. We know the details are going to be good, but when you get to those high leverage moments against really good teams, your number 2 receiver is a guy you signed off the street in August. Like, that is still the reality of where this team is.
No, it's 100% true. And I think back to a pair of conversations I had, one with Sean and one with Kevin O'Connell when he was here. And, Sean would just say, like, it's not about me. Like, it's about these guys. Like, he understands at a fundamental level, like, you're only as good as your players, which means you could be as bad as your players if you do not have good players. And Kevin, I remember talking to him one year when one of the many years, unfortunately, that Jordan Reed was hurt. And he was basically like, right now, defensive coordinators get up in their meeting rooms and where they normally write the numbers of the dangerous guys, they don't write anybody. Or maybe they write like Chris Thompson's number. Like, watch out for him on third down on option routes. And like, that was it. Like, Kevin understood there's only so much he could scheme up. You give him Justin Jefferson and he's got the best offense in the league. And so I think there's amongst the best coaches. And I think Cliff has alluded to this in some of the press conference stuff this year that like, we're only as good as our players. And I got to make sure that our players, and even like some of the stuff with Terry this past week of like, some of these man-to-man situations, we're really struggling because we can't get Terry the football. So let's get Terry the ball. And they do in a bunch of key situations. They move him around in those specific spots, and all of a sudden the offense looks back like the offense again. So that was nice.
I've made this. I've had so many conversations about this year because I think that this season in particular has been a really telling example for this discussion specifically. Situation and how much it matters for quarterbacks or just for your offensive personnel, period. And the thing that I've landed on is that the right offensive architect, again, is a multiplier for your talents. So if you have somebody that's one of those guys, pick your number, you become, as an offense, 1.5 times better than your talent should be. And it can go the other way. Coming into the season, the Bears were supposed to have this great supporting cast. Well, if you have a multiplier to the negative direction, if it's negative 1.5 times as good as you're supposed to be, then you have a situation in the middle of the year where Washington's offense looks like it does and the Bears' offense looks like it does. The problem is 1.5 times 0 is still 0. So if you have no talent, the multiplier can only take you so far. So talent is part of this equation. But in the right circumstances, the correct offensive coaching staff, the correct offensive architecture can elevate that talent. And I think that Washington arguably is the best example of that from the entire league this season.
Yeah, and so, for a lot of the people listening, like, do you have an example of what a offensive architect, like something that would characterize a good offensive architect? Because I think people think of play callers as like this dynamic, he always dials up the right thing. He always does this and that. But in reality, like, that's, you put the game plan in on Wednesday. You know what I mean? Like, they do it on Tuesday. And so, like, it's really just making sure that architecture is in the right space. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I'm trying to think about examples in my own career. Like, Kyle's architecture is way different than Sean's. It's similar, but like, it's going to build different in a different way. And that's different than, the guy that I had when I was in Atlanta, Sark, right? So, do you have a good example of, again, you said details, maybe some specific examples that people can kind of say, oh, I didn't think of it that way. Like, this is good architecture as opposed to negative architecture or whatever.
I think the Rams are probably the first place I would go just because I think it's the most obvious. And if you look at like the 2023 Rams specifically, and you look at some of the things that they were doing with like Puka Nacua, okay? So this is a team that had switched to be more of a duo-centric run team last year compared to being an outside zone team or a mid-zone team for a good chunk of Sean's career. And so they have these downhill duo runs. And for people who don't know what that is, it's just a set of double teams up front. So it's a downhill kind of gap scheme run. And what they would do is they would have Puka Nacua come in motion and insert on some of those runs almost as a de facto tight end. So that's kind of the baseline of their run game. Well, okay, if that's the baseline of our run game, how do we build off of that? And then you would have plays where he would come in motion, insert through the C gap, and run a corner route. So it's just about building on the central ideas that you have. Washington, I'm trying to think of the game that this happened, but there was a stretch where they were doing a lot of this 21 pony personnel stuff, and there was like a lead up run where the one back would be the lead blocker for the other in some of those looks. And so they did that at one point, and then they threw a screen back the other way. So I think it's just about building on your central ideas and having kind of additive answers on top of those things, combined with just consistently making consistently using details to make things easier. Like the double chip stuff I would keep coming back to with Washington, where it's just like every time we're going to have somebody release into the flat, we're going to make sure that he's helping one of our tackles on an edge rusher. So I think it's building on ideas and having everything be cohesive while also having the right sort of details attached to that to just consistently be making things as easy as you can on your guys.
Yeah. I think that's, I mean, I'm really glad you articulated it that way because, again, it's not, people think it's the call. It's like the call on the day. But if the call is like in isolation, like a really good play, but it doesn't fit with the foundational pieces of your offense, you know? So, for example, like you're predominantly a 21 personnel team, but you got this really sick pass out of 11 and you want to spread everybody out, but it doesn't really marry with the rest of your offense. Like it just doesn't work, you know? And so I think that's something, I like the example of the Puka Nacua thing there. And it's cool because again, like it just allows you to kind of build a bigger building and it's fun to see offenses evolve like Sean's offense or Ben Johnson's offense in Detroit. Like you don't run all these trick plays year one, you build to that moment off of the other stuff you've put in. And so, I really like that, the way you articulated that.
I think that the thing I always come back to, somebody asked me this yesterday, when you're watching an NFL game, what are you watching? And I always come back to, what is the intention of the play? Like, what are you trying to accomplish based on what you're putting out there? And you can take this a bunch of different directions. Okay. Buffalo, for example, this year. Buffalo has run more plays with 6 offensive linemen on the field than any team in the NFL. That aligns with their ability to run the ball on their terms now in ways they couldn't 3 or 4 years ago. But the other thing that Buffalo does out of those looks, they'll sling it around the yard because you know they're in base defense. So when you're putting certain position groups, certain personnel groupings, certain alignments of players, when you're using certain motions, what is the intention behind those things? And I think that the best offenses in the league, when you really study them, the intention is obvious. You know what they're trying to accomplish based on all the details of the play. And I think that Washington is a very good example of that this year.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Robert Mays, host of the Athletic Football Show. He and Derek Klassen doing a great job reviewing the games every week, previewing every week, and then Robert typically does some kind of special project in the middle of the week. In the middle, I know you looked at a lot of the contenders this week, did a special kind of report, if you will, on the disappearance of the shutdown corner. Hopefully we have the reappearance of one here in Washington. We'll see how good Mark his hamstring's good to go. But that was a fun listen as well. So check out the Athletic Football Show wherever you get your podcast. Robert, this was great, dude. Always a pleasure. And hopefully next time we see you, it's not fresh off a red eye.
Anytime, guys. Good to see you.
Take command. Craig Hoffman, Logan Paulson. Thanks again to Robert Mays for joining us. Logan, let's switch over to the defense now and the holes that are being left where draft picks used to be. Emmanuel Forbes released on Saturday, so he is gone out. He's actually been claimed by the LA Rams. It's always interesting that they went ahead and claimed him. The contract's not anything crazy. It's like $2 million a year, but the fact that they were like, yeah, we'll take that and make sure that we get him versus just trying to sign him on a league minimum for the rest of the year. Okay, cool. But good for Emmanuel. Hope it works out there. And then Mathis Sunday, former second-round pick, healthy scratch, replaced by Carl Davis, who was called up from the practice squad and played pretty well. So when you think of the holes where those draft picks are supposed to be, just how do you try to explain to people how difficult it is to do what the Commanders are doing, winning with such a dearth of talent from the primary source that you're supposed to get your best talent from?
Yeah, I mean, the way, I mean, and we talk about this in our draft shows all the time, is like when you draft, like your first and second round picks should be starters, like that's really what you're looking for. And even with third round picks sometimes, I think Brian Robinson's a great example of that. You're looking for guys that are going to contribute significant minutes and really are the backbone of your team. And so, to not have Jamin Davis, to not have Emmanuel Forbes, to not have Chase Young, and again, like each one of those picks failed for different reasons or didn't work out here for different reasons. But those are, in my mind, 3 starters. And then to have the second round picks also not work out in certain instances, like Big Phil is, and I think that remains to be seen, so we can kind of keep an eye on that. But I think that's really what you're talking about. And so everyone says, oh, where's the other corner opposite of St. Juice or Mike Sanderstill or Noah Igbenogany? Where's that fourth piece that's really dynamic? And you trade for Marshawn Lattimore. in theory, in principle, should have been Emmanuel Forbes. Whether you take him in the first or second round, we can talk about where he was selected later on. But I think that's really ultimately what I'm looking at here. And so for them to essentially, the Commanders, Dan Quinn, Adam Peters, this whole front office, to have found a way to make this work, to make this work at a pretty high level the last couple of weeks with, kind of free agent signings. You mentioned Carl Davis, like that, he's picked off a practice squad, moving your second round pick to outside corner, finding ways to help Benjamin St. Juste, getting a kind of retread Jeremy Chin to play better. Like, it's all really good. And I think it shows you the power and the importance. And we talked about this with Robert a little bit, like the idea that talent is the main driver, but being able to identify talent and saying we can make this work in our defensive philosophy and defensive perspective, I think has been really like a masterclass by Adam Peters and Dan Quinn and their relationship and their ability to communicate what they need and why they need it.
Yeah, I think part of it, there's two main points that I think I take out of what you just said. And hopefully I don't forget the first one while I talk about the second one. The second one, which is piggybacking right off the back of what you said, like, why was Ron Rivera bad at this and why is Adam Peters good at this? I think it's because they clearly identify, like, one group clearly identified the wrong things and looked for them. The other group clearly identifies the right things and looks for them. Adam Peters and company are looking for a certain attitude and play style and attention to detail and like work ethic and all of those types of intangible, immeasurable things. And of course, like, they want guys that are fast and strong. And, we kind of joked during training camp, you could see out on the field who were the Adam Peters guys and who were the Ron Rivera guys, because the Adam Peters guys were bigger. So it's not like they're not looking for great athletes. I mean, Jeremy Chin's a monster. Like, Frankie Louvu, like, explodes when you watch him in person, or it explodes off the tape. So it's not like there isn't great physical characteristics, but there's also a prioritization of those things coming to life in the game. And I think Ron at times like looked for, hey, Emmanuel's got great length. Chase has like his measurables are great, and Chase is a hard one to criticize because I think a lot of people would have taken him where they did. But Jamin, like, incredible measurables. But there's a lot of football processing stuff where he didn't play like those incredible measurables with consistency in college. And he barely even played in college. So I think the ability to find what you're looking for and know what you're looking for to be able to find it in the first place is the huge separator in terms of good talent evaluation and not good talent evaluation.
Well, I think the other thing too is, like, we can be critical of Ron, and I think rightfully so, but I think there's a reason teams, coaches, GMs have moved away from the coach GM as the same person model. It's for this exact reason. It's because they are two distinct jobs. Like, I went to a thing Big 100 did where Adam Peters was talking, and they were talking about how he came up with Bill Belichick and the scouting process and how he kind of learned and got his background in this really competitive, really kind of intense environment in New England. And he's like, the whole point of scouting is not necessarily like talent identification. Coaches now with PFF and all these different media services, they can identify talent fine. They don't need your help identifying talent. Like, I've had a bunch of conversations with friends at the Common. They're like, we don't need scouts to tell us if they can play football. I can see that with my eyes. What a scout needs to do is all the other stuff you were just talking about. And it's my job as the GM or the assistant GM, because I think Lance is doing a great job of this also, of taking that information and then getting it to the coaches and being like, hey, this guy is a commander. This guy's not a commander. And redlining their list. And then when you give them the list, the coaches the list, they can tell you who they want to work with. Like, and that's the beauty of the new system and the new model, right? The scouts part is the other part. And I think Adam, he said something that I thought was really interesting. It's like, when I was in New England, it was like, can I find that one detail, that one nugget, that one piece of extra film, whatever it is, a conversation with the janitor about him cleaning, whatever it is that gives me that information. And that's why it's two jobs, is because that's unrealistic for Ron, to have to coach and manage, like we just talked about, all the responsibility that the head coach has in the interview we just did, right? They have so much responsibility. And then say, oh, I'm also going to distill all this information that the scouts bring and make excellent decisions about personnel and evaluation. Like that, think about that, man. That's the draft. That's free agency. And think about all the free agents that they have brought in from practice squads, from here, Noah Brown, like all these different pieces. Like, it's unrealistic to expect one person to be able to do that. And especially a guy who's recovering from cancer. So like there's a lot going on there. So I think this is, again, we talk about the changes in the organization. Dan Quinn, great change. But Adam Peters as a separate entity that is working together with Dan is maybe the biggest add, and you see his talent when it comes to some of this stuff.
Right. When I don't know if funny is the right word. The ironic part of this is like Dan goes to Adam with like, hey, I need this for the football team.
Yeah.
And obviously Adam has thoughts on that too, but like there is a cohesion of I am looking for X, go find me X. Adam comes back with X. And Adam and his staff come back with X. Ron was the same person. Ron was like, I need X. Let me go find X. Couldn't find X.
It's hard, man.
It's really hard because they're two different things. Being able to identify X and going to find X are two different things. And by the way, Logan, if I were to tell you, just to kind of wrap up and kind of encapsulate the challenge of what they've done here to fill these holes and make it work to the extent that they have. If I were to ask you like the 3 biggest needs on this team, like your wish list of things moving forward,
sure,
what would they be?
That's a good question. Probably corner, receiver,
and defensive end.
Defensive end, probably.
A dynamic pass rushing defensive end.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Chase Young, Jahan Dotson, Emmanuel Forbes. Like you want to encapsulate how damaging it is to a team to miss on first round picks. Look at exactly what the Commanders need right now. And maybe they filled the Emmanuel Forbes hole with Marshawn Lattimore. We'll TBD and hopefully he's back after the bye. But number 2 receiver, they came into the season hoping Jahan Dotson would be the dude they drafted him to be. Didn't wind up being that. They shipped him out before the season even started. Defense has made it work. Luvu's obviously been a huge part of their pass rush, but if they had, a Bosa, like Adam had in San Francisco, or Myles Garrett, or whoever, pick your guy TJ Watt, how different would this defense be? That guy was supposed to be Chase Young. And, obviously on down the list, corner, we talked about Jahan. They had Bobby is a phenomenal signing, but could Jamin have been helpful? Of course. So on down the list. And not to mention like some interior beef. That'd be somewhere like, hey, can we get a run stopping defensive tackle? Great use of a second round pick. Fedarian Mathis, not working out. So I think that encapsulates just how challenging it is because the exact holes they need to fill are ones that should be currently filled by people that have already been drafted. And there's just limited roster space, limited cap space to do those things. And so when you miss, it hurts a lot.
Yeah, 100%. Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think the other thing is I had a bunch of people ask me, why are they treating Fedarian this way? Or why did they cut Forbes? And I think it's important to take the name away and say, is it surprising that they cut a 6th corner? No. Is it surprising that your 5th rotational defensive tackle is an active one game? No. None of that is surprising, right? It's just take away the name, take away they were drafted. That's how this organization sees those players. And that's why you get these guys moving on and kind of being treated differently. And I think that's got to be a shift in mentality from the previous. I mean, this is maybe a larger conversation we can have sometime next week. But I remember when a new coach comes in, it starts over. I don't care who you are. It's not like, oh, I'm the first round pick, I'm going to be the guy. It's like, I have to prove to you that I'm the guy. And it's not their job to make it go. I didn't invest anything in you as a player, right? So it's up to me to show you. And obviously there's been some issues with guys from the former regime showing that, hey, this is important to me and I want to be good and all those kind of things. So I think it's just to give some context there as well.
Yeah, it's not because you were drafted by Ron, we're going to try to get rid of you. I mean, Quan is one of their guys they highlight all the time. There's a couple of Cosme. They just gave a massive, the one guy they've extended, the one guy they've put big money in is Sam Cosme. So, Terry is by all intents and purposes the captain of this team. And he was 2 regimes ago. Right. So it's a matter of substance. Hey, are you doing the right things? Are you playing the right way? Are you doing what we ask? And the guys that aren't here anymore. And the guys that are contributors in the ways that the people that drafted them had hoped they would be. All right, that's our show for today. Again, we love to hear from you, and we're giving you a chance to do that in 2 different ways. One, if you have questions, our mailbag episode is next week. So go to hoffmanshow.com, fill out the contact link, and you can email your question. Also, I put out a post on Blue Sky. If you want to follow me there, at craighoffman.bluesky. Whatever the hell they're doing over there. Just use the search bar. Search my name. You'll find me. And then on Instagram, you can also hit Logan _Paulson82, or me at hoffman.sports. Hoffman.sports Sports on Instagram. So submit your questions any of those ways, and we'll do a mailbag on Tuesday. Now, we'd also love your opinion on the show. And for that, we are willing to give you a fairly significant discount on our brand new Take Command merch. So go to hoffmanshow.com/survey, fill out the listener survey that we have for you there. And then at the end, you'll get a link with a code for 50% off our Take Command merch, which is available thanks to the good, fine folks at Breaking Tea. For Logan, I'm Craig. We'll see you for that mailbag on Tuesday. Thanks again to Robert Mays. Have a good one, everybody. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.